Or you're waiting. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Good afternoon, APSU community that are watching on APSU-TV. Our partner, thank you for making this a hybrid modality event. This is our first People's Dialogue kickoff in person. We're really happy that you all are here. We hope that you are full and ready for a really fun and really fast hour of conversation. My name is Chris Clark, and I'll introduce myself in a second. And we have a great group of panelists that are here to speak to you today, but we really want to be mindful of the time and get started. Thanks for being here. People's Dialogue event today, as you can see on the screen, is entitled What's on the Ballot? You know, political polarization in America. We're talking about what is on the ballot and beyond, and advocacy in a number of different ways. And we have some very, very important and exciting guests that will be able to engage you in conversation today, okay? So before we get into our guests and the conversation, I'd like to first provide an overview of what we'll talk about in this time. And so as you can see, we have some opening remarks from our administrators. We'll kind of go over some of the components of the People's Dialogue in case this is a new initiative for you and you haven't seen our first webinar to understand what this is about and how you can engage and what you can expect to get from this type of series and workshop. And then we have a panel and open forum, and it's where we can engage in some of the conversations around things that are on your mind, things that you want our experts to hear, and then followed up with resources. We don't believe in engaging in tough conversations without giving you all ways to take the information that you hear, things that you can do, and actually be able to apply it when you walk out of the door. So that's our agenda for today. But before we get into the conversation, I would like to invite up my colleague and friend and co-lead for the People's Dialogue series, Associate Vice President, Campus Engagement, Dr. Lindsay Gilmore, to provide some opening remarks.
I'm a little shorter than Dr. Clark. So thank you, Dr. Clark. And I extend my gratitude to all of you, both those of you that are here today and those of you that are watching through our APSU live stream TV. We really appreciate that. We understand the value of your time, and we appreciate you joining us in this really important conversation today. As we approach the upcoming election and the months leading up to the inauguration, our institution's commitment to civic engagement, dialogue, and discourse becomes even more critical. The right to vote, a privilege that was most definitely hard-earned by generations past, requires informed and thoughtful participation. It's essential that we remember that a healthy democracy thrives on diverse perspectives, and discourse is a part of that. For many of our students here today and watching us, and those that aren't here, this will be their first presidential election, which is really exciting, but also a little apprehensive, right, and nerve-wracking. So navigating the intense political divide can be challenging for any of us, let alone those that are engaging in their right to vote the first time. It's even more challenging when those that we love and hold dear may hold differing views than we do. In these moments, it's easy to become defensive or dismissive. However, practicing civil discourse allows us to listen and potentially understand, rather than simply try and persuade others to join, quote unquote, our side. Right? Unfortunately, though, we really don't have a lot of examples of civil discourse, and it's becoming increasingly rare when we turn on our TV or we open our phone and look at social media. Social media often amplifies divisive rhetoric, making it difficult for us to have those constructive conversations. By cultivating the skills of civil discourse that hopefully you all will see today and be able to practice, we can foster understanding and respect, and even hopefully do so in the face of disagreement. I know personally the upcoming holidays can maybe bring about some frustrations, right? And maybe some apprehension as we think about what is upcoming with the election and everything else. We may have apprehensions around engaging with family and friends that have those differing viewpoints. So it's my hope today, as you all are here and we listen to our expert panelists, that we'll feel more prepared to engage in meaningful conversations. So thank you all once again for being here. I'm really excited that we are kicking off the in-person and the live stream version of our People's Dialogue Fall Series. I'm gonna invite Dr. Clark to come back up, lay the groundwork for our time together, and also introduce our panelists. So thank you.
You're not that much shorter. Thank you, Dr. Gilmore. So now I'll formally introduce myself. My name is Dr. Clark, Christopher Clark. I serve as an Assistant Vice President of Community Belonging. I've been in my capacity since May. I can remember where I've been in every presidential election since 2008. Right. And I know what it means to create space and not create space for understanding partisanship, expression, civil discourse, many of the topics that we are addressing today. So I'm grateful, and I'll be remiss if I did not thank not only President Nakari, but Vice President of Student Affairs, Dr. Leonard Clemens, because this is not an easy thing to do, and addressing this head on, because it's important that you all have the space and you have leadership that can provide space to understand this, is something that is courageous. So this doesn't happen without them. And to have our experts come in from out of state to provide perspective and food and coffee and tea, sorry you all who are not here in person, it also takes time, effort, and energy. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank them for that, okay? So if you look at the site, the People's Dialogue, the mission is really simple and clear. We just want to create space for you all to engage in meaningful dialogue and free expression. And the goal is to bring us together in a community where we can really foster inclusive environments and share perspectives and do so in a respectful manner. And by doing this and talking about specific topics, it's our hope that we can create a campus community that brings us together despite the many differences that we have. And that's the goal of this space. We are now talking about politics, but we have a number of topics that we'll talk about after the election, because there's a number of things that are important for us to bring to the table for us to discuss in a very civil manner, okay? The work that we are doing is evidence-based. Some of this, the components, they're grounded in some work that I've done and some of our colleagues have done. Here are the core pieces that you will be able to experience in this time, all right? We want to bring you together for a conversation, but we don't do so without grounding our dialogue around agreements. Agreements set the foundation for how we engage each other as professionals, as people with good intentions and in good faith, okay? We also want to make sure that what we are doing is inclusive and accessible. That's why we have a combination of in-person and also hybrid, thanks to our partners, APSU-TV, who are willingly giving us the ability to stream this live right now, and it will live online for those to see, for those who can't be here in person. We're obviously talking about a relevant topic because we have a presidential election that's upon us, okay? And I can also hear myself in the background. That's okay. We want to elevate your voices. So many of the things that we're talking about are things that are relevant to you all. You submitted questions, you submitted topics. These are things that you all, our students, that have given us, and we are responding by making sure we bring the experts here to talk about those pieces. We have guest facilitators, not just internal, so we have internal faculty and administrators that are knowledgeable about these topics, but we have external experts as well that can provide perspective on the topics as well. We don't just believe in just training, right? So it's good to train, but we also want to train and provide a space for open dialogue and discussion. Some of that comes from Pat Guerin's work at the University of Michigan, intergroup dialogue. We don't want to just talk to you. We don't want to just educate you. You do that in class. We want to have a conversation, and that's what we'll have as well. There'll be intentional questions that'll be asked. You can ask those. There's 2 podiums here, so at some point throughout the dialogue, we will open up the forum for you to come up to a microphone and ask questions, or even answer a question that is posed, because we do value your perspectives as well. And last but not least, as I mentioned about resources, we don't want you walking out of here feeling heavier, and heavy meaning in the sense that you don't know what to do with the information that you have heard. We want to give you resources so that you can continue to be able to be advocates for yourself and others, and not feel like the burden now is on you if something new is introduced to you during this time, okay? So as you can see, the 3 pieces that we talk about, again, vulnerability, didactic structures, plus open discussion, and continuous involvement. This is not a one-time engagement. We want this to be a part of the continuous spaces that exist, not just here in your classrooms, in your student orgs, in the residential spaces, because it matters more that we have these conversations wherever we are, okay? So now I get to stop talking, okay? So with that being said, I'm gonna move out the way, and then you see these wonderful faces that are in front of you. We wanna make sure we bring our panelists and bring folks that really can add value. One of the things that we are intentional about when it comes to guest speakers is having a number of different perspectives. We want to address the home. The home is Austin Peay. The home is Clarksville. So every time we have People's Dialogue, we want to have a faculty, a staff member, a student leader, someone that can address our core issues for our community. So we always have an internal perspective. But we also want to bring partners. That can be local partners, that can be national partners, to not only add value to what we're addressing here in Clarksville and in Austin Peay, but talk at length at what's happening at a national level as well. So the people you have on this screen, they're going to introduce themselves. I'm not going to take the time up. They provide all of those perspectives. So as they come up to the stage, it's going to be moderated by Dr. Tucker Brown, who is, I want to make sure I read your title appropriately. I'm not going to mess that title up. He's the Senior Vice Provost and Associate Vice President of Academic Affairs, and he will moderate the panel. We're grateful for his leadership, but also his commitment to this by ensuring our faculty have an ability to have a partnership within this regard. So without further ado, I would love to invite our panelists up to the stage, and then as they come up to the stage and take their seats, I would love for Dr. Brown to provide some remarks around his understanding and involvement as it relates to the topic today. So round of applause for our panelists as they come up, and also for Dr. Brown as he provides some perspective. Oh, good. Oh, good. Oh, okay.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Dr. Clark had introduced me, I'm Tucker Brown. I'm Senior Vice Provost, Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs here at Austin Peay. More importantly, though, I think for the context that we are in today, I'm also a professor of sociology. So I pay a lot of attention to trends in our society and how they affect your behaviors. So the first thing I'd like to just kind of introduce or ask of all of you, what's the most important function, what's the most important aspect of a university? What's the most important thing? Go for it.
To promote information and knowledge about the world.
Excellent. First try, we got it. Usually we hear students, usually we'll hear faculty, but to your point, learning, right? The reason we're here, the most important aspect of higher education is that thing, that's learning, right? And so I would be remiss if I didn't try to educate us for this few seconds that I have here. So the topic that we continue to hear about very frequently is this idea of civility, right? How many of us actually know what civility is? Right? How do we operationalize what civility is? So I'll talk about it really briefly, 30 seconds, about what civility is from a sociological perspective, so that this frames not only today's session, but as we go forward as contributing members, civic engaged contributors to our society, that we actually know what civility is and what it is we're talking about and why it's so important, why this topic keeps coming up. So just a couple of little things about that. So civility is a concept often viewed simply as politeness or courtesy, but trust me, it's a whole lot more than that, right? It's a deeply constructed social construct, right? It shapes our interactions, institutions, and communities. The sociology of civility explores how norms, expectations, and everyday life influence power dynamics as well as what we consider civil behavior. And it's not just about our individual manners, right? It's a framework for social cohesion. It's a structure for how we interact with each other on a daily basis. When we act with civility, we reinforce a social construct, a shared understanding of respect and cooperation that enables us to coexist peacefully despite differences. Sociologists have found that civility plays a crucial role in sustaining democracy, fostering social trust, and creating environments where diverse perspectives can thrive. And so I hope that that will frame not only today's discussion, but as we go forward and the remaining people's dialogues for the year, that we can continue to think about civility and why that matters to us as a society. Thank you. Okay, now, so with that said, we'll get to the fun part. If you all want to take a second to introduce yourselves, I think that's probably the best place to start.
I assume it's on. Okay, great. Hi, it's great to see so many of you here, and also hello to those of you online. My name is Jen Domagal-Goldman, and I am the Executive Director of the National All-In Campus Democracy Challenge, and I'm going to talk a little bit more later about what All-In actually is, but I'm here today. I live outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland.
Got you there, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia Antigua. I am also with All In. I am one of the program managers, and I cover most of the campuses in the South. So if you think of me, I am really Virginia through Texas. I'm working with campuses. And so you all are one of my campuses, and I'm just really happy to be here, talk with you all, and learn from you all today.
I am Dr. Michael Bednarczyk. I am not with All In. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at Austin Peay, and I study American political behavior.
We are ready to let's go.
And now back to me. So I'm here to set the stage for a bit with sort of the what and the why. So if you look at the board, I have lots of different levels of government listed, both in the state level and at the federal level here for Tennessee, and then I have dates after them. And those dates are important because those are the dates that Republicans took control for our delegations. So for example, you can see the Tennessee House of Representatives became Republican in 2008. The theme from this is that for a long time there has been Republican control of not only the state levels here in Tennessee, but also at the federal level. Going on at the same time is voter turnout here in Tennessee. And if you look, we're #1 at being last. We historically have had very low voter turnout in the volunteer state. And now I'm going to try to unpack a little bit of the whys behind both the Republican control, the loss of democratic power, but also voter turnout here. And the big story, I think, can be told through the lens of polarization. And what we've seen over time is a large sorting in the electorate, where people are now sorting into parties based not only on ideology. So it's not just liberals are all on one side and conservatives are the other, but we've also seen sorting based on geography. We've seen sorting based on religion. We've seen sorting based on ethnicity. And as these groups become better sorted, these identities tend to stack. And they become what we sometimes call a mega identity. So what happens as a result of that is politics has now become far more personal. We're not just debating policy ideas. We're debating who we are as people. And politics then becomes far more emotional. You're not just losing at the ballot box. If your party isn't elected, it's not that you're not going to see your preferred policies enacted. It's far more than that. It can be seen by many as a rejection of your identity, of who you are. So politics has become emotional. It's become, and because of that, it also tends to short circuit the way we think. Because when we're emotional about things, we don't think critically. So we have all of these factors, which helps explain why things have become so polarized, because once you're sorted into these groups, you don't interact with people that are in the other side, you don't understand them. There was a great study that asked Republicans to describe Democrats and Democrats to describe Republicans, and nobody understands one another. Democrats thought that a third of Republicans make over $250,000, and it's more like 1%. And Republicans thought that a third of all Democrats identified as members of the LGBT community, and it's less than 10%. So these groups don't understand one another because they're so distinct. Now, voter turnout. The story there is a little more complicated, and they can add a lot more to that discussion, but I did just publish a paper that tries to predict what voter turnout's going to be for this election. And I look at a host of different factors that could matter. And the things that always bubbled up, no matter what, #1 was education. The more people in your state that have a college degree, the higher turnout you should expect. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Wanted to make noise. Can I say thank you, Michael? Because I'm afraid if I try to say your last name, I'm gonna.
That's fine.
And I will just say, please call me Jen, because I have a big, long, hyphenated last name, and no one needs to try that. So I think you have, and just so everyone understands the format, we're gonna each say a few things before we kind of open it up for a broader conversation here. And I think you've raised some really important kind of historical points and context. And you know, I'm going to elaborate a little bit about part of what you said, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the work of All In. But what brings me here, so my background is in higher education, and I worked on a number of different colleges and universities, got my doctorate in higher ed, and have thought a long time before coming to All In about 6 years ago about the role of colleges and universities in our society, right? And so I think the question that we asked first, and the answer about learning is really important. And one of the quotes that I hold really near and dear is from an educational philosopher whose name was John Dewey. And he said, democracy must be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. And there's been a long tradition of the role of education institutions from K-12 through higher education in terms of helping us think about our role in this democratic experiment, this experiment of American democracy, of our constitutional republic, right? And we can talk about all of what those terms mean and all of these different things, but education is a really important component. And part of what we've been talking about, civility, being informed voters, all of these different pieces are a piece of that. And so, you know, when All In was established in 2016 as a national nonpartisan effort that works with colleges and universities around the country, the reason it was established is we had access to data for the first time. So I think about when I was a college student, as my middle school daughter would say, in the late 1900s. So in the 1990s, Congress passed a piece of legislation called the Higher Education Act, and one of the pieces in there says that higher education institutions receiving federal dollars are required to make a good faith effort to provide voter registration information to all eligible students. And when I was a student back then, I did not know that was a rule, but the way it happened is you registered for classes in person after you stood in a line that went around the student union or some other building, and they had a stack of paper voter registration forms there that you could choose to take or not, right? And my freshman year was a presidential election year, and I had grown up in a family that was split politically. So I had a father who was a Republican, a mother who was a Democrat. Both were avid voters. We often had pretty animated conversations at the dinner table. And I knew I wanted to vote. I knew who I wanted to vote for. And I was so busy trying to pass calculus as somebody who eventually majored in English, and so busy trying to get along with my roommate, who I've never spoken to after finishing freshman year. She's now a federal judge that doesn't live very far from me, and I probably should look her up, but I have not. Anyway, that I think I would have missed my chance if it wasn't for the fact that my mom sent me my paper absentee ballot form that I had to request the absentee ballot with, because we couldn't do anything online at that point, right? So I filled it out, sent it back, got my absentee ballot in time. I was at school about 3 hours down the road. I didn't have any other way of getting home. And sent it in, right? And so, you know, that was my experience. There's pieces of it that I'm sure resonate with you now. There's pieces of it that are very different than how things happen now. What we've known, and part of this is what Michael has said to you, is that folks who have at least some college education vote at higher rates, vote more often than their counterparts. There was an assumption made that the same was true for college students like many of you, that you know, we often see the media depict college students as politically active, as colleges as places where kind of new ideas are bubbling up, where, you know, we're protesting different things, or we're thinking about new ideas, where we come up with different ways of, you know, talking about an issue or a set of people. And so the assumption was that that political interest was translating to high voter turnout. And then a study was established at Tufts University outside of Boston, and we got data starting in the 2012 presidential election and the 2014 midterm election. And the only years we can get the data are years that everyone is eligible to vote, where we have a national election, either a presidential or a midterm, right? And the data was dismal. It was so bad. And we got that data about 2015, and then All In was started in 2016. And part of the work has been to kind of hold campuses' feet to the fire and say, we have to maybe do a little bit more than this like good faith effort, and a good faith effort needs to be kind of more, how are we reaching all of our students with the information they need, and how are we doing it particularly because in many states, K-12 institutions have abdicated that work. They have not done as much civic education, right? And so slowly but surely, that's part of what we've been doing. And so part of what you're seeing on the slide behind me is, you know, when we were established in 2016, we kind of kicked off at the beginning of June, and then, you know, by the time the election rolled around, we didn't have a huge impact, but we got folks paying attention. We had about 150 campuses that were participating across the country, really thinking about who on their campus might be the designated faculty or staff member, thinking about how the campuses and student groups were doing some of the nonpartisan group work of registering voters, of talking to their peers. When I was a student, we definitely had the college Dems and the college Republicans. I don't remember anyone else talking about any of that. And maybe it was because I wasn't taking political science, but, so I think there's this important piece. Now we're working with over 1,050 colleges and universities across all 50 states, including 27 here in this great state of Tennessee. including kind of a revived relationship with Austin Peay University, which actually joined in 2019, and are really helping campuses think thoughtfully about this work, right? And so a piece of that is that we say we provide structure, support, and recognition for campuses. So part of that structure is we ask campuses to designate someone who's going to be leading on this requirement and to kind of create a coalition of folks to think about the work, and then to create an action plan. So a plan for how they're going to take some of what we know works and implement it. And again, all nonpartisan, all designed to help make sure that students understand how to access their right to vote, that they understand where they're able to register and how, what kind of ID they might need, what the process looks like, to kind of demystify some of it, and to really think through those steps, right? And so in those, 8 years we've been doing this work, what we have found is that campuses that do those steps with us are now outperforming their peers by about 4 percentage points, which is kind of a big deal. And we have seen the student vote movement kind of grow. And so we're seeing more and more college students be heard from. So part of the issue is many of you are first-time voters. Many of you are first-time voters because you're also the first time you're 18 and able to vote, right? And a piece of that means that you're not on the contact lists for candidates yet. And so you aren't getting as much information until you're registered from your Secretary of State's office or from candidates or from other things. And so just getting to that first piece, once we know that the research says that once you vote for the first time, you're more likely to continue to vote. We also know that when you go to school away from home or when you are more mobile, right, so you're moving addresses, you move from campus to an apartment or from this apartment to another one or all those pieces, that information kind of breaks down, and so there's more information needed to do that. So we're certainly not talking about who you should vote for, what you should care about, but we want to make sure that that process becomes demystified. So I'm going to look at my phone here for a minute on my data because I want to share some data about that kind of goes into what Michael said, and I promise I'm almost done. So let me ask you this. If I tell you the data was dismal, what do you think the voting rate in the 2014 midterm election was? Anyone want to take a guess? Shout out a number.
50%.
15? It was 19. So yeah, pretty dismal. And in that first presidential election we had data for 2012, it was about 45%. So under half, right? Now those numbers were actually lower in Tennessee. And I don't know what your numbers were then for Austin Peay specifically. But in 2020, we set records kind of across the country in terms of youth voting in a presidential election, as well as kind of adult voting, older adult voting in a long time. And one of the pieces that we saw here, I want to make sure I get this right, friends. Okay, here we go. So Austin Peay's national or voting average in 2020 was 54.5%. The average by that point nationally was 66%. And your registration rate was about 76.3%, which was just higher than the national average. The other piece that this study, when campuses participate in now, tells us are some demographics, and one of those is area of study. So I told you I was an English major as an undergrad. What's interesting here is in 2020, while your overall rate was at 54%, English majors here voted at about 71%, and education majors at 66%. On the other hand, students and these are federal brackets, so students in what is federally called Parks and Recreation only voted at about 41%, and students in law enforcement voted at about 48%. Nationally, we tend to find that STEM and business majors vote at lower rates, and both of those sets of majors here voted at under what your campus average was. Now, I say all of that because it's kind of connected to what Michael talked about in terms of Tennessee having consistently lower voter turnout. And we, in addition to what you heard him say about college rates kind of playing out eventually in terms of higher voter rates. The other thing that tends to predict voting rates is how easy it is to vote. So unlike many states in the South, Tennessee has done some really great things. You have early voting that goes on through tomorrow. You can do online voter registration. So there's some great things, which then also says that part of the reason we think turnout is lower goes back to some of this political ideology and the fact that states that tend to be consistently at the presidential level kind of deep blue, that tend to really go for the Democratic candidate, and on the converse, states that tend to be kind of deep red often have lower voter turnout because folks don't think their vote is going to make a difference. And rather than unpacking that now, I'm going to turn over the conversation to my colleague Liv.
So I'm here to really talk to you as the resident member of Gen Z, the panel. I'm also here to kind of give you the what's next and what do I do with all of that information. And I want you to think about the conversations you have with your friends and thinking of your future. The things that you care about, you're in college so you can hope to get a good job after, to have a stable life. We have this idea of what we consider the American dream, and when Gen Z is polled on what issues they really care about, you're thinking housing, you're thinking jobs, you're thinking climate and environment. You're thinking of these big, full-scale things because you're worried about your future, you're worried about your community, but you're thinking them so abstractly of like, oh, nothing can happen because of this deep color of Tennessee, or if we're going to take the inverse, thinking of like California for an opposite of deep blue. But what people don't often understand when they're talking about these large elections in the presidential election is that these national issues have a lot of local solutions. And these races have the lowest turnout. They have the lowest information. And so what I'm going to ask for you guys to do in terms of those action steps is to really think through your plan and think of those things that really matter to you. So we have the QR code on the screen if you don't know what your plan is. The early voting tomorrow, if you have an absentee ballot, my homework for you is to fill it out and then mail it today so that it can get to where it needs to be. And if not, make a plan. Who are you bringing with you to the polls on election day? Because those local races can be literally determined with a handful of votes. My local state representative, I live in Kentucky, was voted in with less than 200 votes. My friend who lives in Knoxville elected a state rep with 75 votes. Really small, really small. And so when we often have these conversations, you're like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. But if you're thinking about housing, you electing your municipal city council member, your county council rep, is the one who's choosing those zoning laws to decide how much housing is available, or what are the rules to make it more affordable. If you're thinking, jobs, you're thinking of your state rep who has the ability to rewrite tax codes to bring incentives. And so you can start thinking smaller. Think of your community. Most of you at Austin Peay are in-state. You might not stay in Clarksville, you might stay down the road, but this is still your home. This is still your community. And I want you to think of not just you after graduation, but you in 10 years, and care smaller. Care about your friends, your family members, and the future that you want. And so when you're building out your plan and you're like, I have no idea where to start. I don't know this judge. I don't know this dog walker that's listed on our ballot. You might have to dig a little bit more than TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm sorry. You might have to do a Google search or two. But it's worth it because it makes it feel a little closer. It makes it so you're able to have those closer conversations so they don't feel as polarizing. You and your parent who have completely different ideologies that are fighting over, reproductive rights or climate or healthcare or whatever can come together and say, we're both really mad that there's not a stoplight right there. How can we talk about that? How can we talk about the pothole in the road? I felt like I was the most important person in the world when I emailed my city council member about a light that I needed in our neighborhood because we kept having traffic accidents, and we got one like 2 months later. I was like, this is my moment. I'm civically engaged. So I want you guys to start thinking small. You can have these big issues that everyone agrees with, but what are those small values that make your day-to-day life better? And think about that and how it transitions to your ballot. So we have the polarization, we have those ideological silos, but bringing it closer makes you think of your neighbor, makes you think of your friend, instead of that enemy that you don't understand. So that is kind of like my little homework for you before we open it up for dialogue. What is your plan? And how can you start looking up those people? And again, it's going to have to be more than Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. I know TikTok will give you the answers. It might not be the right answer. Do a little bit more work. We'll get that misinformation. But think closer, because it matters. And this is my second presidential election, which seems crazy. I'm 25. And I already have seen the impact of casting my vote. I'm saying I care about my community, and I care about my future. And I know you are in this room because you do too. The people who are watching, I know you do too. Think smaller, and it seems a little less scary, and then you know your voice matters. Back over to you.
Technical difficulty. All right, thank you for bearing with me on that. All right, so just for a few moments, we're going to kind of just take a look at what we mean when we talk about the People's Agreements. And so as we move forward with the question and answer dialogue session, just some basic ground rules that we're going to be thinking about. So one is that we're going to be speaking from personal experience, right? And as you know, those things can be often emotionally charged. So with that, we're going to do our best to listen, understand, not necessarily respond. And when we do eventually get to a point of response, we're going to want to really respond from a very rational place, right? And really thinking and empathizing with the people who are speaking and knowing where these messages are coming from, that they're a reflection of their own personal experiences, which may or may not be our own, but certainly don't invalidate them. Some other pieces too, we want to make sure that we embrace discomfort as a part of growth. And I talked a little bit about civility, but that's the point of civility, that we don't have to agree, but we can still respect each other, and we can think about these things, and we can grow, right? Because again, why we're here to learn, and part of learning is growth, right? We're going to assume positive intent, but own the impact. So we know that our intent is positive, but the potential impact that the things we say and the things we speak about affect others, right? So we want to be mindful of that. Vegas rules. You all know what Vegas rules are, correct? Right? So what we talk about in here stays in here, right? Which means, and everyone else too, but why that's important, what that means is this is a safe space for us to be genuine, right? And we want to honor that as best as possible, okay? We want to be open to challenge and change, and this is certainly can be very difficult, right? Often ideas that are not our own or that seem very different to us can affect us in ways that we're not expecting, right? So we want to process this, and we want to go slow with this as much as possible. And then last but not least, we want to contribute to a brave space. Every one of you that is here is courageous today, right? This is important. These are our lives. This is our society. This is our future, right? And the fact that you're here really illustrates to all of us that you're vested in that, right? So we want to do our best to utilize this space, honor this space, and maintain it so that we can continue to do this. All right, so what we have here then is I'm going to confess to all of you, I am not a person that sits down to talk. So it is a struggle for me not to be walking all around here. So we do have some pre-submitted questions. We're going to pose these to the panel, as well as maybe some of you will want to comment. And we'll just sort of let the panel field these. And as you all feel the need to potentially engage yourself in the conversations, we can bring you up as well. So the first pre-submitted question we have, and these are not easy ones. How can we combat misinformation during election cycles? What are some ways to bridge the ideological divide in America and foster more constructive political dialogue? That's the golden question, right?
Well, great.
Olivia is going to take it.
So I want to jump in with the mis and disinformation kind of question. And my gut reaction is always when you see something and you're not sure, or you're pretty sure, especially when it comes to anything political, anything news related, is to check. And I will bring this kind of closer with more of a funny, comical example. I, and Jen can tell you, and she'll probably laugh when I say this, I'm a big Swiftie, okay? I am the queen of falling for when is Taylor Swift gonna do A, B, C, or D thing. And I will be scrolling online, mindlessly scrolling, and be like, ooh, Taylor Swift is going to show up in this sparkly new bodysuit at this date, this time, and give me the new album I've been waiting for. And I'll send it with my friends without thinking about it. And then I'll be like, wait, no, she's in this place, or here's this fact check. And I'm like, oh, no. And it can be, or mis and disinformation can be something as silly as the color of Taylor Swift's outfit that she wears on her Eras Tour concert, right? Or it can be as serious as, okay, so-and-so showed up to the ballot, caused a disruption, and now you can't go vote, on the more serious, scary kind of side. And so when you're seeing these kinds of things, when you're like, I'm going to run with this, can we stop, take 30 seconds? Can we verify? My friends and I get on each other now for all the Swiftie misinformation that we pass to each other. And I know, I said it's silly, I know, but now when I see something, I stop and say, this makes sense. Let me check my internal Taylor Swift encyclopedia. Let me look at some valid sources. And as silly as it sounds, I have really applied it. And Jen's nodding because she knows this is true.
Mostly true. There's still questions that pop up in the work Slack channel about whether something's going to happen. So
Okay,
I'm just
yes,
saying.
I still will occasionally make a fool of myself on the Taylor Swift front, I will admit that. But I have kind of used that guide set to frame and ground myself when I'm talking politics and looking at policy. Is this someplace I always go because it's, verifying the dopamine in my brain saying, ooh, I like this? Is it challenging me? Is it something I don't like? And so kind of grounding yourself in those silly kind of examples of when do you check when you send something on, I'll use Twitter as example again, from pop-based, and you're like, oh, X, Y, Z celebrity has died, but it's not actually pop-based, it's a fake account that they've made. It's happened to all of us, and it can be those silly small things, but when can you stop yourself and be like, is this right? Does this sit right? And especially with algorithms and AI giving us more and more fake wrong answers, it can really be 30 seconds to a minute of just checking and make sure, is something else popping up that seems right? So my guide to you, especially within these next 5 days, is pause, check, and if you're not sure, send it to a friend and say, do you know if this is true, who won't make fun of you, but will lovingly tell you and fact check you. We all need to have that friend.
Well, I can speak to the second part of the question as well. So that's the ways to bridge the ideological divide in America and foster more constructive political dialogue. A helpful way of doing that is breaking out of your own ideological silos. So I mentioned earlier that with the stacking of identities, we understand the other side less and less. And I talked about the study where people didn't understand, but then once they were told, like, hey, actually, the demographics look more like this, then suddenly that ideological divide started to narrow, and people said, well, they're really not so different from me. I feel closer to them now. So just being exposed to this information. And a lot of it has to be intentional because we've self-selected, our Twitter feeds or the news sources that we read. So we're in a little ideological echo chamber. So we're only hearing the same messages from the same sorts of messengers. So it's really helpful to intentionally go beyond that and say, well, if this is what I'm hearing, what are other people hearing? And that can just be conversations with them like, hey, where do you get your news? What are you listening to? What are the stories that are important to you? And then investigating those on your own. Then you can better understand where they're coming from, who they are, and what's shaping a lot of their thinking.
My colleagues up on stage are 100% correct. I think, the other piece are, and it's inherent in part of what we've heard both of them say, is it's checking the emotional piece of it, right? It's if you have an emotional reaction, you're either really excited because the news that you think you're hearing, enhances what you believe, right? Or you're really pissed off about it, or something in those ends of the spectrum. That's where you want to do the double check, right? And you want to make sure it's real or it actually happened at this time frame and not from, however many years ago. Like, I love that you come up and somebody shares something on some sort of social media and you go and you read it and it's from, 2016 or, whatever. And you're like, okay, they didn't just say this. It's not new news. It's some old thing, or sometimes it's fake, right? And I think the same can be true with some of those conversations, right? So I go home, to my extended family, which is in the central part of New York State, so a state that's traditionally thought about as blue, but a very deep red kind of part of the state. And it can be really hard to have conversations with extended family members who I don't see very often, who have very different points of view than my own, right? But I think kind of the same thing, right? Like, try to find the common grounds first, some of the things you care about, right? So whether it's, for me, their grandchildren or, other things, and then be able to build on that. And to try sometimes, I had a faculty member when I was in school that said, part of what we have to try to do is find the truth in what we oppose, kind of a little t kind of truth and the error in what we espouse. Like, when are we potentially saying a piece of wrong information, and when is there some truth to what somebody else believes, even if it's not the way you think about it, right? You know, their experience, you know, of the economy under a specific president may have been better or worse, right? And that may not be the way the overall trends were, but that's their experience, right? So how can you help find those moments and then kind of be able to have that conversation from there, I think can be really important and also really hard. So I just want to acknowledge that as well.
Thank you, Jen. So we'll move on to the next question. So what is the best method for engaging with or avoiding hostile engagement with people who are vocal about their beliefs that differ from your own? I don't know who wants to field that one first.
Well, that one can be challenging. But to sort of echo some of the themes that we've already touched on, it's trying to find that similar ground, the things that you can agree on, that may be distinct from the important issues that you really want to discuss, but that you can ground it in the personal, the familiar. You know, lots of times when we're talking about policies or what we want to see happen, they're coming from a very similar moral background, moral foundations, and the expressions of them differ. But, you know, whether it's a commitment to fairness, a commitment to equality, some of these sort of universal principles that we all deep down generally agree with. So it can be helpful to also try to think of them, well, you know, their what is very different from my what. And their whys may not be there, but the foundations are awfully similar. So if we can get back to, you know, well, I see where you want to go with this, but I think my way of getting there may be a little different, and let's explore that. So try that.
And as both of them have said, this is not something that is comfortable to do whatsoever. A lot of times it can feel very awkward. It might come up and you're in a heated conversation and you don't know how you got there. And something that has really stuck with me over the years in terms of, do you engage or do you avoid this contentious or potentially contentious conversation, is, are the people on the other side of you engaging with vulnerability? And for me, vulnerability is the key to building trust, is the key to understanding someone else. So if I am sitting in a room and my guard is up and I want to just yell my beliefs, are we ever going to have an honest conversation with one another? So when Jen was saying, knowing the errors in your ways, kind of breaking yourself down and being like, this is why I care about this. This is who I am as a person, and I'm coming to you sitting in what I feel is my truth, and I want you to see me as I am. That is very scary. Vulnerability is scary and beautiful. And so I want you to kind of sit in that vulnerability, that icky kind of feeling. And if the person on the other side can do the same, you can have those productive conversations where you can learn about one another. It's a lot easier to find what that common ground can be. If it's as simple as a pothole or a stoplight, or if it's something as important as we both see value in some of the same ways that we grew up, doesn't matter. But if that other person isn't going to be as vulnerable with you as you're trying to be, that conversation, in my opinion, is one that I tend to avoid. If that person can look me in the eye and say, this is why I feel the way that I am, and I see that vulnerability back, that for me takes that red light to a yellow then green. That's how you move forward. And acknowledge, don't be afraid to acknowledge when you're wrong, when you're feeling icky, when you're like, maybe I just didn't know this. I think vulnerability and acknowledging we're all still learning, and that once we graduate and get a piece of paper, it doesn't mean you're done learning for the rest of your life. And breaking down those walls really help.
I'm curious, you know, what some of you think about this question too, but, you know, I think a few things. One is having a couple of stock answers that you're willing to say that can kind of shut down the conversation in a gentle but firm way, in a boundary, particularly when it's like family members at home over a holiday, or the random person who starts a conversation with you in a coffee shop, or, you know, someone that, you know, you either don't want to be in the conversation with, or that you, whatever, you know, being able to say, I hear that that's your story, or that's your opinion, you know, we're just gonna have to disagree, or, you know, whatever that is. Having establishing your own boundaries and knowing, like, I have the one family member who I try to avoid at all costs having any political conversations with when I'm home, right? And just because I know that it doesn't go anywhere. We always perform the same circle of conversation, right? Versus part of what I love about higher education, and hopefully the spaces we're creating here and in classrooms, is like hopefully coming to that with an interest in learning about why someone thinks differently or has had a different experience than you, right? And I think creating those spaces and allowing yourself to meet and talk to people who have had very different experiences and have very different ideas than your own across a range of things and not just their politics is really important and is part of what is so valuable about kind of educational experiences, right? And so, really checking kind of your assumptions and being willing to engage in those conversations, particularly as long as the other folks are willing to do that same thing and have that vulnerability, I think is really important. And being able to explore and figure out your identities. We've been talking about all these political identities. I was on a campus a couple of weeks ago where they wanted to talk about political identities, and part of the conversation we had was many fewer people are, young people particularly, are choosing to register with a political party, right? Are choosing, and it depends on the state a little bit on whether or not you have to register with a party in order to vote in a primary, but many of them are not identifying that way anymore and are thinking more about the issues they care about. And you've heard a little bit about that, right? But I think there are other things that create part of our political identities, and some of them are these things that Michael talked about, stacking, and some of them are, I have a daughter who's in middle school, and I very much think about things as a mom now, right? Like, and when I was in college, I didn't think about it that way, but I think about what I think is going to make her growing up better, right? And I'm sure other people you care about, younger siblings, children, whatever. But I think, that has in some ways become part of my political identity, more so than, a capital letter that, the political process thinks of me as, right, or whatever. And so I think thinking through like how I also think about myself as a member of my community, right, as someone who is going to be a regular voter and who's going to do the homework. And so I think thinking about that and finding the common ground of how you identify with each other as members of Clarksville or as governors, right, mascot, I think that's important too.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panelists for those responses. Before we go on to this next slide, is there anybody in the audience who would like to sort of build off of what we've talked about? Any questions that remain that you'd like to pose to the panel? Just so that we can sort of keep a coherent stream of thought here. If there's anything that's on your mind that relates to what we've talked about, please come up to the microphone and don't be bashful. All right, we'll get you on the next one. Okay, so here's our next series of questions. First one, is there a direct correlation between Tennessee having some of the strict voter integrity laws and Tennessee being one of the worst regarding voter turnout? And then part two, if so, what reasonable action can an individual take to have any meaningful effect? Easy one.
Well, I can speak to a little bit of the first part of that. So the study that I did trying to predict voter turnout, I mentioned I dumped a lot of different variables into this model. And one thing that did come up, which tended to increase voter turnout, was the presence of having same-day registration. So if you can go on election day, register to vote, and vote at the same time, those states generally see much higher turnout. So that's not something that you can do in Tennessee. So if Tennessee did want to shift to a higher voter turnout, my model suggests that shifting that law could do that. Now, how you do that, I'm not so certain, but that's what my model's telling me.
So I think to build on that, there are a number of, and that is one of the biggest ones, is same-day voter registration. So the idea that you can register, prove your registration and then be able to vote on the same day, while it takes a little bit longer, has certainly played out in that way. And but I think there are other things that Tennessee's already doing that would lead you to expect, based on that you would have higher turnout than not, right? So the fact that you do have online voter registration, that there is an early voting period, and those kinds of things should be helping in some ways. So I think a piece of it becomes like how, and it's interesting because there are some other, so Utah is another state that has had kind of huge through the roof volunteer rates in terms of a civic health indicator, and really low voter turnout. And again, a piece of it is because there's an expectation that the Republicans on the ballot are going to win, and therefore that they may not need to show up. And so I think a piece of it, a piece of the change is, yes, if you can advocate for same-day voter registration, that's really great. A piece of it is probably checking some of the accessibility to polling places. So are they easy enough to get to in spaces where, how far away is it to walk to, or is there public transportation? So there are certainly things that can happen, but the other piece of it is kind of this sense of like a civic voting culture, right? And so this is part of what we talk to campuses about, is it needs to be something that's talked about, and first-time voters often need to kind of be invited into the process. Part of it is just reminding of the dates and deadlines in enough time to make sure. So it's always interesting to me when we do voter registration in some places where we see campuses, you'll have a student who comes up to try to do it and then doesn't know the last 4 digits of their social security number to fill out the form, or doesn't know what address to use if they're an on-campus student, because it can't just be the post office box you have, it needs to be a physical location. So there are these kind of stumbling blocks, I think. Also, frankly, with students, a piece of it is more of them think they voted than actually did. So there are a set who request their absentee ballot, turn it back in, it doesn't get back in time to be counted, or they didn't do it correctly, right? They colored in something outside of the set of boxes, they chose too many candidates, they didn't sign or turn in the secret seal, they didn't have somebody date it, right? And then those ballots get cast out, and those mistakes are more common for first-time voters. So I think talking through those processes is also a piece, and that's where the role of the institution can be really helpful. So we've seen campuses do absentee boba tea parties, right, where you sit there and request your absentee ballots, or do things, we put that QR code up there in terms of making a plan to vote, understanding, okay, where is the polling place, how could I get there, do I need to put a stamp on my absentee ballot, what's on, how do I figure out who these people running against each other for judge, where I have to vote for 3 out of 6 of them, where do I find that information? And that's part of what we break down on that website, are ways that you can go and find that information. So I think it's both kind of some of the process and things like that, but then there are pieces within that on a more local level we can start to create that culture around.
And just to add on that, speaking with more first-time voters, I don't want you all to be afraid to ask what you think is the stupid question, if you will, to ask what you think is an obvious question, because 9 times out of 10, it's not. And if it is, okay, it's a quick answer, and you can go about your day, and you can go to the right place, you can fill out the right thing, you can, sign the secret letter envelope the proper way. I still answer this time of year, because my friends are like, you are the voting girl. I will ask you every single last one of my voting questions. I love to do that. Love to do that. My phone has been blowing up with my friends being like, I don't know what to do. And I will sit and I will answer every single last one of them. If I don't know the answer, I will look it up. I would rather you all ask the questions to your friends. You go up to the tables where they're tabling for voter registration and ask for the things, than say, I don't know, so I'm just not going to do it. I don't want you to cede your voice in your community when there are those local races that can be decided with the 10 votes, the 75, the 200. When you're thinking of yourself, don't cede your voice, ask the question. There are people like me, there are people like us that are happy to answer them and will do it every single time. I might roll my eyes at some of my friends when they've asked me for the 10th time, but I still love them and I'll answer it again anyways. So ask the question.
Liv reminds me of something I did at the airport this morning. So I was flying out of Reagan National Airport, and I got a text message from a former colleague who now works for the DC Board of Elections. And DC has some really great voting laws. Same-day voter registration, easy access drop boxes. They have a drop box on at least one drop box on one of the college campuses in DC. And most of the students at this campus are not from DC, right? So they live all over the country, and they vastly choose to keep their registration at their home state and vote absentee because you don't get as much voting power in DC, right? Like they don't have a senator, right? You don't have as much voting power, right? And so the drop boxes aren't used a ton. It's mostly faculty and staff on campus that drop it off there for their, for the local races, a handful of students. Well, they picked it up yesterday and they had a ton of absentee ballots for other states that people had put in the DC election drop box. And so her question to me was, hey, I know you work with this campus. Do you know who the best people are to contact to make sure they're getting the message out that like they can mail those back in to their states, but they can't drop them in this drop box when they're for a different state. And like, we're gonna put these in the mail, but like, I don't know if they're gonna get there in time. Like, I don't know if you saw, so the post office recommended that yesterday that people try to mail their absentee ballots back by yesterday to guarantee delivery. And part of that's given how far different states are. And so, if you haven't yet, do it now, but also it's probably fine. But that's a situation where someone didn't ask the question, someone made an assumption, and it's not, it's not an entirely unreasonable assumption, but I've never thought to say that to a student before, which is if you're voting out of state, it has to go in the mailbox, not the drop box, So every time we go through this, I learn something new about how, something that we need to make sure is not kind of an assumption that we have, right? And so one of the things, when I got my absentee ballot in college, I checked my campus box religiously because my dad would send me a letter with like a $20 bill slipped in, and we didn't have Amazon, and we didn't have whatever, and we didn't have Venmo, right? So if I was getting money, like it was coming like in a check or a, dollar bill, and students don't check their mail as often today because if they get a package, you get some sort of text message or email or whatever. So we've been working with campuses to have their campus mail rooms flag elections mail as packages. Because what's happening is they're not checking their mail for so many days. It's been sitting there and they don't get it back in time, right? So there are all of these things that we can think through in a very systematic way to help students be able to vote. And again, once students vote, they vote more often later. So, this is all helping. The other piece, though, that predicts higher voter turnout is going as a young child and going with your parents or another loved one to the polls. So you better bet that my daughter wore her future voter t-shirt and got her little sticker on Sunday when we early voted. And so, I think there are certainly things we can do in a systemic, legal way to make things easier. There are other things that we need to be doing to help, regardless of what that is.
Thank you. All right, so moving on. How can voters become educated about issues from unbiased sources, or at least balance the bias received from opposing sources?
So one of the things, if you go to that Plan to Vote QR code that we shared, it leads you through steps. One of them is research your ballot, and we send people to something called Ballot Ready. But there are a couple of different sites. One's Ballot Ready, there's another one called Ballotpedia, and then the other site I really like is vote411.org, which is run by the National League of Women Voters. And all three of them are sites that you can type in your address that you're gonna vote from, and it brings up what's gonna be on your ballot, and then helps you go and find information about who those candidates are. Some of them send you directly to the candidates' websites, including Judge or whatever. And in the case of the League of Women Voters, one of my favorite things about it is they do a survey. And so they send a survey to all the candidates, asks the same questions, then it posts their answers next to each other. So when I start to look at school board that I had to vote for or judges, it's kind of like an open book test, friends, right? Like, a month ago, I couldn't have told you who I was going to vote for a judge, but in the last week or so, I did my homework, I went and looked at it. Honestly, if there's enough candidates and one of them didn't bother to fill out the survey, I think, and then I can look through their answers. So it's not just what they're choosing to say in a shiny way on the website where you have to kind of dig. It literally says, like, this is what I think about, how long sentences should be. This is what I think about in terms of, family law and whether kids should go back to parents. This is what I think, whatever issue you care about, you can kind of look at that. And, the League of Women Voters is nonpartisan. It started as an effort to enfranchise women, right? So we had the 19th Amendment that passed in 1920, so recently celebrated 100th anniversary of giving women, particularly white women, the right to vote. In some other states, we had more work that didn't kind of see fruition until the 60s. But what's interesting, if you don't know it, is that Tennessee was the state that was the last one needed in order to have that law go into effect, right? Because it has to be passed by Congress, and then an amendment has to be adopted by a proportion of the states. And so, I think the League of Women Voters in particular has been a huge influence here, has done a lot of work. And if you're trying to find information that's unbiased and that's in candidates' own words, but also in a comparative way, it's a really great place to look.
So yes, echo everything Jen said with Vote 401 and the League of Women Voters guides. On more of a local scale, a lot of times your local papers will do a voter guide as well. So if they haven't answered the Vote 411, you'll type in your local paper voter guide, and that will also pop up one. Those tend to be, not behind a paywall so that you can see them. And that can also kind of help break down some of those barriers in terms of, who is I like saying dog walker for some reason, who is my local dog walker that I'm voting for. Yeah, I don't even have a dog. But I will also say, in terms of doing your homework, I have also recently learned from some of my friends that they didn't know that you could take paper notes into the ballot with you. So if you're voting in person, you can write down those answers that you're like, oh, I want to vote for so-and-so for judge, so-and-so for city council. You don't have to have it. It's not like the ACT or SAT or your GRE. You can have your answers in front of you if that makes you feel more comfortable. So if you're having those conversations with your friends, with your family members, trying to sort it out, I was literally considering taking one of the local guides that was mailed to me that I trust and find valid to kind of help me do homework, highlight who I like, and take that in with me when I go early vote in Kentucky on Saturday, because we have ours that starts on Halloween, which is interesting. But take your notes. Your local paper also tends to have local guides, so if you're not seeing it on the state side, type whoever your local paper is. Sometimes your college campus will do some of them, sometimes they don't. That will also help ground you in that.
And I know that Clarksville Now has interviews with some of the candidates that have been running. So that's a good resource for you as well.
One other quick answer, which is I love a really good either debate or candidate forum, and actually being able, particularly when it's local pieces, if you have that available, check it out. Even if you only go for a little bit, you get a sense of kind of who, in some of those pieces, who's a straight shooter, who's, giving real answers, who's doing that kind of thing. And I think a lot of times, really means something, particularly when you start to think about school board and other kind of smaller elections where there are very specific concrete issues and they actually can make a change on them, right? I think that piece kind of really matters.
And when you go and you're under the age of 30, they get very excited because they're like, oh my gosh, who are you? And because those things tend to be very local and very small, when you're showing up and you're saying, I'm here and I care about my community, they see you as, oh, you are a rising leader, you know what you're saying, you care about your community. And that's also actually kind of a cool way to learn from the people around you, and you can kind of get some cool mentors out of that as well. So I would echo that as well.
Thank you, Olivia. Does anybody have any follow-up to either of these two questions? And if you do, please come up to the mic. We would love to hear from you.
I've got a question.
Oh, hold on, we'll give.
I won't need a mic.
Oh, okay.
You're from Kentucky. You're in an overwhelmingly Republican state, but yet your governor is Democrat.
Yep.
How do you think he pulled that off?
Oh, let me repeat that question so our viewers at home can hear as well. So the question was related to Kentucky being a largely Republican state that has a Democratic governor, and the real question was, how did Kentucky pull that off?
Kentucky has a very, very long kind of working class history, very similar to Tennessee, that has some of those roots. And so I believe it was 2020, maybe 2021, when it officially flipped that there were more registered Republicans in the state of Kentucky than Democrats, believe it or not, because Kentucky was an ancestral Democratic state until about the 2000s is when that trend started to flop. But I think that kind of grounds us back in our discussion earlier of like seeing ourselves as not a red state or a blue state and actually looking at the politicians that are in front of us and what they stand for and believe in. And something that I've really appreciated about the governor is that he really tries to work across the aisle and listen to people and see them as they are and be like, I am here for you. I am here. I see you as my neighbor, as a fellow Kentuckian. And that has really broken down barriers where he's had very high approval ratings from both sides of the aisle. And he was just recently reelected for his second term because he's willing to have those hard conversations. And something in terms of the voting rights side, him and the Republican Secretary of State were the ones that came together during COVID and expanded early voting, expanded all these voting rights and access things, even though people on both sides were kind of saying, oh, what are you doing? Why are you working with the other party? And it's made voting in Kentucky more transparent, more clear, and accessible in ways that benefits everyone in the state. And so, you know, thinking of those action steps and working with one another, there are two people on opposite sides of the aisle that said, I see you, I see there's a problem, I respect you as a person, can we work together? And because he's led that way, he's been reelected and is very popular. And I think it's a model that I hope other people kind of take away from, like how can we just you can have your deeply held beliefs and still respect somebody on the other side.
Thank you. That was a great question. I think a lot of us have thought about that. I know we had another question. If you want to come on up to the mic, go ahead.
Okay, this mic.
Yeah, that should be on.
Alrighty, so this is more for like national elections and like state or local, but do you think like when you're looking at the candidates, is it a good idea to like not just go for like one or two sources, but go for like each side's perspective or like every viewpoint on the candidate?
Good question.
You know, like, because like, I know like I'm planning on becoming a historian, and like when studying a historical event, you got to look at every viewpoint. You can't just look at one book or source.
Thank you.
I think that's a great way to look at things, of having the different viewpoints, of trying to ground yourself in another person's shoes. I think when we think of that, we think of like the golden rule, treat people how you want to be treated. And then at the same time, I also acknowledge that people are people, humans are humans, and sometimes if it's not on the top of our priority list, we, you know, turn on autopilot and default to our own personally held beliefs and things. So if you can look at those multiple sources, if you can slow yourself down, I think you are definitely better off. But then remember those times, like when do you need to lead with vulnerability? When do you need to acknowledge that you have those memory gaps so that you can look at those different perspectives? I don't think any of us, we can say these things but expect to be perfect. And so I do want to acknowledge the humanness of it, I think that is a fantastic idea. And then I think some of you will be like, oh, well, Liv, I'm super busy and I think you're, you know, full of it and I'm not going to listen to you. So when you can slow yourself down, I definitely think that you should. But just acknowledge that none of us here are perfect or expect you to be perfect when you're making your informed voting decisions.
Anybody else with a question out there? I know we're getting close to time.
This doesn't directly answer your question, but I think is a really important piece, particularly when we look at folks running for the presidency, and I'm not just talking about our current candidates. They tend to have to make promises and say what they believe in a way that makes it sound like they're going to be able to do this themselves. And then the expectation is when they haven't done it is that they were lying, disingenuous, whatever. And you know, it's really, it's this vicious cycle where we all learn, hopefully. We have, you know, 3 branches of government that they work, you know, to counterbalance each other. And the president can't just do everything by executive order, right? And too often lately, we've had such a divided Congress that that's the only way we've gotten some things done, and then we end up fighting it in the courts, and then some of that gets overturned, and some of it stays, and then the next president comes in from a different party, and we overturn it, and we change it again. we have to be able to move towards actual compromise, which means listening to each other and hearing those truths, right? And we have to also realize that even if they say that they're going to do something, it doesn't mean they can. It doesn't mean they even plan to if they could, right? Like, they have to run so far on promises that aren't possible. And so recognizing that that's true regardless of party, and thinking about whether they hold similar values that are going to guide what they sign or don't sign, that what they're going to champion and not champion, versus like, did those 5 things that were promised happen in those whatever, or did whatever. Like, it's the slow movement towards something versus the actual thing that sometimes I think matters. And so, you know, to go back to your question, like, yes, we need to look at broader perspectives. We also need to realize that we've created very specific mechanisms that people have to talk about themselves as they run for political office, and we have to remember to put our thinking hats on, or remember that they can't do those things by themselves, and to both realize that we have to all be together beyond November regardless of what happens, and that part of that means we also have to hold whoever is elected in whatever positions we care about, we have to hold their feet to the fire, because they are meant to represent all of us. And so to really think through, you know, how we're thinking about our ongoing political engagement. And I say that in a like lowercase p, like, when are you sending that letter? When are you, you know, calling up a congressperson's office and saying this is what you're hoping they're doing? Like, how are you making your voice heard in that space is really important too.
Thank you. All right, so this is going to bring us close to the end here. We will pass it back over to Drs. Gilmore and Clark.
Thank you so much. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. That was really lovely. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you for taking something that can feel scary and overwhelming and making it more digestible, kind of using the analogy of eating an elephant one bite at a time, right? When we have something that is feels very arduous and overwhelming, thinking about it in that way, I think, makes things easier. So I know I definitely took some nuggets of wisdom away, so thank you very much. So we have some resources up here. Please feel free to scan the QR codes, a lot of various resources that I think are very helpful, especially for our first-time voters, with polling locations and learning about candidates, different things along those lines. I want to say thank you once again to all of you for attending, both here in person and also online. Thank you to our panelists once again for traveling in and for taking time out of your schedules. Thank you to Dr. Clark for being my thought partner and colleague in this. I appreciate all the work that you've done, our colleagues in student affairs, of getting our folks here and you know, helping to volunteer and things along those lines. And to our collaborators, check out our People's Dialogue website. We've got a lot of information about our various collaborators that are here at the institution. And then I just challenge you all to think about, what is your action plan that we talked about today, right? So I really like the idea of taking national issues and thinking about local solutions, right? I think that's a very digestible, tangible thing to look at. And what is your voting action plan? How are you going to do it? What are you going to research? What's that going to look like prior to you stepping up to the ballot and actually voting? So thank you once again to all of you all, and thank you to our senior level leadership for supporting this initiative. And with that, please grab food. We have plenty of food and beverages back there. And thank you. November 13th is our next People's Dialogue. Nope. Is it this? It's the 13th. Yep, it's the 13th. Same time, same bat channel. So here, the 13th of November at 3 o'clock in this ballroom, and we'll be having a very similar format, but with a different topic. And we'll be announcing our presenter and our topic in the next week or so. So stay tuned. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon.